Right. Well, we are beginning today with the study of 2 John, and I talked to the guys and said I will introduce it, and then next week, Gary Hall is going to be looking in more detail at 2 John. But I want to just give you an overview and a general introduction to the one very small letter of 2 John. And so we're going to divide it up in several ways, but first of all, I want you to know that as far as who wrote this, he doesn't tell you what his name is in the book, but the ancient writers and translators all in the ancient world attributed this to John. And by the way, if you look at some of the things about the way that he writes, the themes that he writes, it's clearly the themes and the language of John constantly throughout. There's never really been any question as to who this is. But in the book, he calls himself in 2 John chapter 1, the elder. And somebody said, well, what does that mean? Well, it can mean that he's just older, which he probably was at the time that this is written. We think maybe toward the end of the first century, that he was an older man. Or maybe it means that he actually was an elder in the church, in which case I've heard people say, well, if he was an elder, then he couldn't be an apostle, so it can't be John. Well, that's not true. I can just tell you, do you remember when Peter in 2 Peter or 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 1, when he writes to elders, he said, to the elders I say, who also am a fellow elder. Peter was an elder. And at the same time, he was an apostle. Being an elder doesn't exclude the idea that you could be an apostle as well. An elder, a shepherd, an overseer, they're all the same thing. Do you remember when, just looking at it from different angles, in Acts chapter 20, verse 17, and then again in verse 28, I want you to think about that he said, now from Miletus, Paul sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church to come to him. And the elders came to him. What does it say in verse 28 when he's talking to them? Take heed to yourselves and to all the flock among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. So the elders who came to him are also overseers. They're also shepherds. They're all the same people. It just describes them from different perspectives. So is it possible that this John could also be an elder? Somebody says, well, there's some things that you would have to qualify for. And among them is that he has to be the husband of one wife. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, it says in verse 2 that he has to be the husband of one wife. And we have no indication that John was married. But yeah, we do. We actually do. I want you to listen to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5, where it apparently tells you that all the apostles, with the exception of Paul, were married. Listen. Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? In other words, what happened when they made their missionary journeys? They took their wives with them. He says the other apostles have wives. Okay, Paul didn't, but the other ones did. So there's nothing to disqualify John from being an elder in the church as well as an apostle. What I want you to do is kind of look at this man, John, some of the things that we know about him. In John chapter 13, verse 23, it says, one of the disciples whom Jesus loved was reclining at a table at Jesus' side. John, again, in the Gospel of John, never says that he's the author, and yet universally it was taught and believed and known in the early church that this was John. How does he describe himself? As the disciple that Jesus loved. He is the disciple that Jesus loved. Did he have a special relationship with him? Apparently he did. Peter and James and John went with him in some places where the other apostles weren't able to go. So he had this special relationship with the Lord. Then I want you to look at John chapter 19, verses 26 and 27. Jesus is hanging on the cross. And it says, and when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. And then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. Jesus entrusted Mary to John's care. That's John. If you want to know something about how important this man is, he actually takes care of the mother of Jesus. Not only that, But he was one of those who witnessed the empty tomb. He actually was there. When you want to see it, who was there, he was one. Listen to John chapter 20, verses 2 through 10. It says that she ran and went to Simon and Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their home. He was there in the empty tomb. This is John, actually physically there in the empty tomb. And he, among the others, saw the resurrected Lord. Listen to John chapter 21. We'll start with verse 7, then skip down to verse 20. That disciple whom Jesus loved, therefore, said to Peter, "It's the Lord." Now, this is when he eats breakfast with him. He's seeing him. They're out fishing. He sees him. They go. They eat with him. It's what they do. When Simon heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. And then verses 20 through 23. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back against him during the supper and said, "Lord, who is it that's going to betray you?" That's John again. When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If it's my will that he remain until I come, what's that to you? You follow me." And then John makes this comment that I think is interesting because it was misunderstood by the people who overheard. So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple, talking about John, was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he wasn't going to die, but if it's my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? In other words, Jesus said, what difference does it make to you, Peter, whatever happens to him? He said, he's not saying I'm going to live forever. That wasn't what was going on. So this is the John. He's highly qualified to write the things that he writes to the church. He was actually there. He really is an apostle. And so many of the words that you read about in 2 John are reflective directly of the words of Jesus. Like, for instance, when you see that John says in 2 John verse 5, love one another, he can say that because not only is the will of God, but he's actually personally heard Jesus say it. John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. This is really incredible, but he's actually heard Jesus say it. He's reflecting Jesus' words. Or how about this one in 2 John verse 6? This is love, that we walk according to his commandments. Now, Jesus had that same link between love and obedience. Remember John chapter 14, verse 15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. That kind of goes right back to the same idea. And then John writes in 2 John verse 9, everyone who goes on ahead and doesn't abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. What's he doing? He's echoing the words that Jesus himself has said in Matthew chapter 7, 21 through 27. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it didn't fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who builds his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. In other words, when he says the things that he says, he's not making up something new. He's dealing with a new doctrine. If you look at 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, they apparently are dealing with a new doctrine that has arisen among members of the church, and it's Gnosticism. Gnosticism, the idea that there is a dual being, both the flesh and the body, which expresses itself in a couple of different ways among the Gnostics. One was that you have to deny your body everything in order to be right with God. And the other, which was far more popular, was that whatever you do in your body doesn't affect your spirit at all. So the body was inherently sinful anyway. So whatever you do, if you commit adultery or get drunk or anything else, it doesn't affect your spirit because that's a separate thing. And it was in danger. And by the way, they also said that the Gnostics said that Jesus actually didn't die on the cross. It was a manifestation of Jesus on the cross. And so he has to combat that. But how does he combat it? He combats this new doctrine with the old things that Jesus has said. The world will come up with all sorts of new ideas. I'm just telling you, they will. They're really old ideas, lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, and pride of life. They're always going to be there. It's always going to be that, but it'll have new iterations of that. How do you combat that? With the same teaching of Christ. It's what John is doing here. He's reflecting on what Jesus said and said it has specific application to the times that he's living in. Well, let me move on. How do we know the date? Well, we don't exactly know the date, but we believe that it was toward the end of the first century, probably written from Ephesus because that's where we know John spent the last days of his life. And he ministered to the churches, by the way, that were there near Ephesus, and which makes it very interesting when you look at the book of Revelation and you see the 7 churches of Asia. Those would have been churches that John would have known and written to and probably visited fairly often. So we're probably looking toward the end of the first century. What about the genre? Well, it's an epistle. What does that mean? It's not a book, okay? It's not long enough to be a book. But it wasn't intended to be a book, nor is it intended to be a treatise. It's a letter. It's just a letter. It's an inspired letter, but it's just a letter. Okay, what's a letter? Well, a letter's made up generally of 3 parts, and they're here too: the salutation, the body, and the conclusion. This is the way we write letters. When you write a letter, I know it's kind of a lost art now because we use our text messaging and everything else to do it, but you generally write the letter. Interestingly enough, that when they write the letters in the Old Testament, or in the time of Jesus, it was actually more logical than what we generally do when we write a letter. We'll write a letter, and at the end we sign it. So have you ever gotten a letter and you have no idea who it is? You just have to skip to the end to figure out who it was, and then you go and read the letter? They didn't do that in the ancient world. They introduced themselves at the front end. He calls himself the elder, but everybody knew who he was. Okay, so they introduced themselves, and so there's that salutation, the greeting, and then there's the body of the letter, whatever they want to say in the letter. And generally, when it comes to epistles in the New Testament, the body is instructions and commands, and that's what it is really here. And then a conclusion at the end. It's a letter. And if I can read it like a letter, it makes a lot more sense to me. Can I just tell you, sometimes I was talking to one of our foremost Greek scholars just the other day, listening to him talk about the Greek and the Hebrew and what we know and what we do. And this was an interesting thing that he said. He said, if somebody has to take 5 or 6 minutes to tell you what a Greek word means, don't listen to it. He said, you can read it in the English and it's pretty accurate. And he said, you don't really have to know Greek. You don't really have to know. He said, there's some things that are good, that are helpful in that, but the Bible can be understood by anybody who just reads it. He said, just read it and do it. So if I sit down with 2 John this week, and I hope you'll read it every day this week. It's so short. You can read it even more than once. But I want you to read it like a letter, okay? If you got a letter from somebody, in this case it's from John, I want to hear what he said. And it becomes clearer and clearer when I read it like a letter, not when I read it like a treatise or some kind of intellectual educational device. That's not what it is. It's a letter. Who's the recipient of this letter? Well, he calls her the elect lady. Who's he talking about when he calls her the elect lady? Can I just tell you that there are some people say it was a woman in one of the churches, and elect means chosen, so one of the women in the churches. But I don't think that's true, and I'll tell you why I don't think it's true. Why I think it's a congregation and not an individual. 2 verses that stand out to me in that. Here's what he says to the elect lady, that she should love one another. What does that mean? The elect lady should love one another. How do you do that? It indicates more than one person, okay? The elect lady is a body of people that ought to be loving one another. So I think it has to be a body of people, not just a single individual. And the second thing that gets me is verse 13, where John writes to this one congregation from another, and he says, your elect sister greets you. And so another congregation greets this congregation. It's, to me, fairly clear that we're not talking about an individual. We're talking about some body of people that are Christians. Okay, so what are the themes? Well, if you look at verse 2, one of the themes is that the truth of Christ is eternal. In fact, truth shows up throughout this, and I'm sure Gary's going to tell you more and more about that as you look at it. In the second place, that Christian love and compliance with God's commandments are inseparable, and he'll tell you that in verse 6. He also wants you to know that false teaching is everywhere. 2 John verse 7. Be careful about false teachers. And then finally, I would just say, well, where is it? I think I've missed one somewhere. Okay, well, that's okay. But I meant to add one more and somehow I didn't. But the next idea is don't support people who are teaching false doctrine. And that's verses 9 through 11, okay? Don't support people who are teaching false doctrine. So love is a focus, truth is a focus. If you look at John, they're always going to be love and truth in all the writings of John. You're going to find that to be the case. He wants our love to extend not just to God, but to other people, but be discerning and don't go on beyond biblical revelation. Again, verse 9. And love doesn't mean that I'm supposed to lend aid to people who, through their message, become enemies of the gospel. I'm not supposed to be doing that. That's, again, verses 10 and 11. I'm not supposed to be doing that at all. So guess what background do you see this? Well, hints are in the letter, okay? One of them, he tells you there's a need to love each other in verse 5. What does that tell you? That maybe they're struggling with their loving of each other. By the way, I don't know of a single church that doesn't at some point among some people have an issue with loving each other. You know, people are different. You know, folks are not always nice, and sometimes our perceptions are all out of whack. I remember a gentleman who was here in this congregation years ago, and if somebody walked through the lobby and walked by him and didn't say hello, he was pretty sure that they didn't like him. He was pretty sure that they weren't very good Christians. Well, they had all sorts of stuff on their mind, and I finally had to tell him, look, I appreciate you, but you're not that important. You're not the center of everything. They may have other things they need to do. I said, people don't say hello to me sometimes, and that's okay. They've got stuff to do. They got other fish to fry. We need to love each other, okay? Not look at the worst of each other, but to love each other. And then in verses 7 and 8, that we need to beware of deceivers, that there are people that are using the church for their own ends, and we need to be aware of that. He tells you in verses 10 and 11 to show hospitality to missionaries. In the early church, there were evangelists who traveled all around the ancient world. And there was one that you'll talk about at some point when you get to the writings of John about Diotrephes, who refused to accept missionaries who came in, even refused to accept John as an apostle. And he tells them, look, if these guys are teaching the truth and they're spreading the message, you help them. That's what verses 10 and 11 are about. And then in verse 12, he tells them that he's hoping to come and they need to be ready for them. So these are different themes out of the book or the letter of 2 John. If you're looking at an outline, here it is, at least one. An outline is just something that I make up or somebody else makes up, and you can outline it in a lot of different ways. But there's the greeting in verses 1 through 3, the elder's love. And then in verses 4 through 6, his joy and his request. And then verses 7 and 8, his concern. Verses 9 through 11 is his warning. And then his farewell is in verses 12 and 13. And that's the book as we're looking at it. What I want to do now is just take a moment and just read through it. It doesn't take long, 13 verses. It doesn't take long at all. And I hope that as we read it, you'll say, oh, I get this. You know, it's not that hard to get, okay? The elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth. Because of the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever, grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father's Son, in truth and love. Notice again, truth and love. Keep looking. I rejoice greatly to find that some of your children walking in truth. I find that a really interesting phrase. I rejoice that some of your children walk in truth. What does that tell you? Some of them probably don't, okay? But he's decided to focus on the ones who do. Sometimes we focus more on the ones who don't. But in this case, I rejoice to find some of your children walking in truth. There's the word truth again, just as we are commanded by the Father. And now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing to you a new commandment, but the one we have from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. And this is the commandment, just as you've heard from the beginning, that you should walk in it. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Again, that was a common thing among the Gnostics. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. And I'm going to let Gary spend a whole day on the Antichrist. Gary, I'm so thankful. He's over there saying, no, thanks, Bill. But anyway, watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and doesn't bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting. For whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. Though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face so that our joy may be complete. The children of your elect sister greet you. Well, that's the book. That's the story. That's the letter that he writes. And it's really short because he's not going to go into detail about the problems with false teachers and other things because he's going to be in person talking to them. This is just setting the stage for him to be able to do that. But I hope as we go through this book, as we go through this study, that it's going to be really helpful. This is one of those that we don't actually study very often for several reasons. One is because it's so short. Two is because it does not contain any new doctrine. Everything that it says is something that you've already been taught somewhere else. John has already said it in one of his letters, or Jesus has already said it. And so every single thing that he says. But it is important. It is important. There are deceivers that are in the world. There are people who are coming into the church that say that Jesus Christ did not come in the flesh. They say that because if Jesus was sinless, the Gnostic doctrine says that the flesh is inherently sinful and that the spirit is inherently righteous. Their philosophy meant that Jesus could not have come in the flesh because then Jesus would have been a sinner. And Jesus was not a sinner, therefore Jesus did not come in the flesh. And again, I'll leave it to Gary to outline that doctrine a little more. But anyway, this is part of what they're doing and part of what they're saying. And so he wants them to know, first of all, yes, he did come in the flesh. But more than that, he wants them not to lose their peace over this. He wants them not to lose their love over this. Do you remember when John, or actually Jesus, is writing, and John's the person who's putting it down on paper, when Jesus is writing to the church at Ephesus, it was a great church. In so many ways, it was a great church. You remember? It was a church that was doctrinally sound. They tried people who said they are apostles. They tried false teachers. They found them false. Not only that, but they worked really hard, and in fact, they're working harder now than they did at the beginning. It was an amazing church. It was really doing great. They fought for the right and the truth always. But in the process of all that fighting, they lost something that was going to cause them to lose their place with God. And that is, they had left their first love, okay? They left the love that they had. They're still doing everything. They're doing everything and doing it well, doing it right. And all the indicators are, if you went into Ephesus and you're looking for a church, you say, oh, this is my congregation. Look at this great church. Look at all the good they're doing. Look at the mission work they're doing. Look at all of this stuff. It's a great church. But they're not loving anymore. They're not loving anymore. The great danger when we are involved in defending the faith is that we lose ourselves in the process of defending that faith. That we lose the love that we have for one another and ultimately lose our love for God. I remember a great missionary in a foreign country who came back to the United States and was very concerned at the doctrinal impurity that he saw when he came back after years of working in a foreign country. He saw that the church, many of them, had devolved away from the fundamental teaching that they should have been teaching. So he began preaching and teaching and writing about that. And his intentions were good. They were really good. But after a few years, the writings that he did were writings from a poison pen. They talked about false teachers. They talked about other folks. And it got to a point where it became a rumor mill rather than a defense of the truth. And it was harmful. His intention in everything that he started out was absolutely pure. But somehow in the process of all the fight, he forgot to love the brethren. Somehow in the process of all that fight, his love for God missed the point that he who loves God must love his brother also. He forgot that. It's easy for us to forget when we're involved in doing the right thing. I always get a little nervous when I'm around people who present themselves as defenders of the faith. It always bothers me. It does. Do I think we ought to defend the faith? We ought to contend earnestly for it. The Bible's clear about that. But too many times, we lose ourselves in that process. So he tells you, you're in a fight. You're in a fight for the essence of Christianity, that Jesus Christ came in the flesh, that he actually did, not just representatively, that he actually did die, that he actually was buried, that he actually was raised, that this really happened. And it's the essence of the gospel. It is the critical part of the gospel. You must believe this. It's a fight for our doctrinal purity. But don't forget that it's a fight for our soul. And if I forget that it's a fight for the soul, then I forget everything. Well, our time is almost up, and I'm going to end. Yes?
And Gary may be dealing with this next week.
Gary's going to deal with any question you have. He's so good.
But having just taught 1 John in here, I remember that he said, "These things I'm writing to you, that your joy may be full." And we know the theme of that book was to give them the assurance of their salvation. But here in 2 John, he says, "I want to come see you so my joy may be full."
I love that.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. And it works both ways, doesn't it? I mean, that is true. He loved being with them as much as he hoped they would love being with him.
And I think it speaks to the church to which you have addressed this morning, that the church needs to understand one of the greatest joys of being a minister of the gospel is seeing and being with those who are walking as they should.
That's good. That's good. It's true. It is true. And we cut ourselves out of great blessing when we miss it. Yeah. We do. Well, this is good. The amazing thing about having David and Gary and Steve in here and some of the other guys that are in this class is that if I drop dead right now, they could end this class better than I can. They can teach it better than I can. And I really love being around smart people who really know the scripture and everything else. It makes me feel better, even though it makes me feel dumber. It really does make me feel better. I love being around guys who got the experience and the background, and thank you, David. By the way, I was at the Corvette Museum, and the guy who came in 1952 and actually created the Corvette, they have a bust of him, and he looks just like you. And I've got a picture of him I'm going to show you. And now I need to put him in a Corvette. That's what I need to do, because you look just like the guy. It was incredible. All right, well, you don't need to know that. Let's have a prayer. Father, we thank you so much that you're our God. We thank you that you've given us your word. We thank you that there are times that it's poetry. There are times that it's a treatise. There are times that it's a letter. There are times that it is something, in every case, that touches us, changes us, and makes us better. Thank you that every word that falls from your mouth are for our learning, and help us to learn. Help us to look deeply into what you've told us and to find what you want us to find and to live as you want us to live. Bless the people in this class. Bless your church everywhere. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks. By the way, y'all be praying for me. As soon as this class is over, Beverly and I are jumping in the car and heading toward Knoxville. I have to speak tonight at Southeast Institute of Biblical Studies at 6 o'clock their time, which is 5 o'clock our time. So pray that we don't get a flat tire. We're on our way. But thank you. Thank you so much. God bless.